He thought she was weak, broken, dependent. He thought losing her job meant losing her power. So he took everything from her, slowly at first, in ways that almost looked like concern, and then all at once, in ways that left no doubt. Her dignity faded in small moments no one else saw. Her voice grew quieter until even she barely recognized it, and the identity she had built over decades began to slip through her fingers like something fragile he never intended to hold gently. But what he didn't realize, what he never stopped to consider in all his certainty, was that the woman he believed he had reduced to nothing was watching, learning, enduring. And the more he tightened his grip, the more something inside her began to change in ways he could not measure or control. He thought silence meant surrender, he thought patience meant weakness, and he mistook her stillness for defeat. He never imagined that every word he spoke, every action he took was being remembered with a clarity that would one day matter more than anything else. And the night she came back, when the quiet finally broke and the balance shifted in a way he could never reverse, everything changed. Because this isn't just a story about abuse, it's a story about patience, about transformation, and about a kind of revenge that doesn't announce itself until it's already too late to stop it. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. David never imagined his life would be measured in moments like that. Knock on the door, but long before that night, before the silence and the distance and the quiet tension that settled into every corner of their home, there was a version of their life that looked almost ideal from the outside. He and Linda had built something that others admired, a steady marriage shaped by routine, mutual goals, and the kind of stability that comes from years of shared responsibility. They met in their late 20s, both ambitious in different ways. David focused on climbing the corporate ladder while Linda built a reputation as dependable, intelligent, and quietly driven in her own career. For more than 2 decades, their lives moved in sync: early mornings, long workdays, evenings that blended into predictable comfort, and weekends that felt earned after years of discipline. Friends described them as balanced, the kind of couple that didn't need to prove anything because everything about them seemed settled, secure, and understood. But even in those earlier years, there were small details that, in hindsight, carried more weight than anyone realized. Comments David would make about roles and expectations, subtle preferences about control, decisions that always seemed to tilt slightly in his favor, even when they appeared mutual. Linda noticed those things, but she had a way of smoothing over discomfort, of choosing peace over confrontation, of telling herself that every relationship required compromise. She believed in partnership, believed that respect could be maintained even when perspectives differed, and for a long time she convinced herself that what they had was built on that understanding. Her career gave her independence, not just financially, but emotionally. It was a space where her voice mattered, where her decisions carried weight, where she wasn't defined by anyone else's expectations. That part of her life anchored her, gave her confidence, and balanced the quieter adjustments she made at home. And then, without warning, that anchor disappeared. The company she had worked for over a decade announced restructuring, the kind that comes with careful language and impersonal decisions, and within weeks, Linda found herself walking out of an office she had once considered a second home, carrying a box filled with years of effort reduced to a few personal items. It happened quickly, too quickly for her to process fully, and when she got home that day, the shift had already begun, even if neither of them said it out loud. At first, David responded the way anyone would expect, offering reassurance, telling her they would manage, reminding her that one setback didn't define everything she had accomplished. But reassurance has a way of changing tone over time, and in the days that followed, his words began to carry something else, something sharper, something less patient. He started asking questions that felt less like concern and more like pressure: how long she planned to be out of work, whether she had already started applying, what her plan was. Linda tried to keep pace with his expectations, updating her resume, reaching out to contacts, searching for opportunities in a market that wasn't as open as it once had been. Weeks turned into months, and with each passing day, the gap between who she had been and who she was becoming grew wider in David's eyes. He began to comment on her being at home, casually at first, then more directly, pointing out the obvious in ways that didn't need to be said, reminding her of what she no longer had as if she needed the reminder. The change wasn't immediate, but it was steady, and that's what made it harder to confront. David became more critical, less patient, and increasingly dismissive of anything Linda said that didn't align with his perspective. He controlled the finances more closely, shifting access in subtle ways, making decisions without consulting her, framing it as practicality while slowly removing her sense of involvement. Conversations that once felt equal turned into one-sided exchanges where Linda found herself choosing silence more often. Not because she had nothing to say, but because speaking seemed to lead nowhere. The house they shared began to feel different, not physically, but emotionally, as if the space between them had expanded in ways neither of them acknowledged directly. Linda's world became smaller, defined by routines that revolved around the home, while David's continued unchanged, his work, his schedule, his sense of purpose intact. But what David failed to notice, what he overlooked in his focus on control and certainty, was that Linda hadn't stopped thinking, hadn't stopped observing, and hadn't lost the ability to adapt. Her silence wasn't empty, it was full of questions, reflections, and decisions that took shape gradually. She began to study everything, his habits, his patterns, the way he spoke, the assumptions he made about her. She paid attention to details she had once ignored, small inconsistencies, changes in behavior, things that didn't quite fit the version of reality he presented. And while outwardly she appeared to settle into the role he seemed to expect, inwardly she was rebuilding something he couldn't see. She started learning again, quietly, using time he assumed was unimportant to develop skills that didn't require his awareness or approval. She found ways to earn small amounts of money independently, nothing noticeable at first, but enough to create a sense of progress, enough to remind herself that she wasn't as limited as he believed. As months passed, David grew more comfortable in his perception of control, interpreting Linda's calmness as acceptance, her lack of confrontation as agreement. He stopped questioning the dynamic because, in his mind, it had already been settled. That was the moment everything began to shift in a way he couldn't reverse. Linda's understanding of their situation deepened, not just emotionally but strategically. She began documenting interactions, saving messages, noting dates, building a record of behavior that, piece by piece, formed a narrative far different from the one David assumed existed. At the same time, her financial independence grew, slowly but steadily, until it reached a point where it no longer felt fragile. She opened accounts he didn't know about, structured her resources carefully, and planned each step with a level of patience that came from knowing she had only one chance to get it right. The night everything changed didn't begin dramatically. It started like any other evening, routine, quiet, predictable. David returned home expecting the same environment he had grown used to, the same version of Linda he believed he understood. But something was different, not in a way that was immediately visible, but in the way the air felt, in the way silence held a different weight. When she finally spoke, it wasn't loud or emotional. It was measured, clear, and precise. She laid everything out in front of him, documents, evidence, details he hadn't realized she had been collecting. At first, he didn't understand what he was looking at. The shift in power didn't register immediately, but as she explained calmly and without hesitation, the reality of the situation became impossible to ignore. She had already taken steps he couldn't undo, legal actions initiated, financial structures secured, everything positioned in a way that left him with far fewer options than he had ever imagined. For the first time in years, David found himself in a position he didn't control, faced with consequences that had been building quietly while he assumed nothing had changed. The confidence he once carried gave way to confusion, then to realization, and finally to something he had rarely experienced, uncertainty. Linda didn't raise her voice, didn't argue, didn't seek validation. She simply stated what was already in motion and what would follow. The marriage he thought he defined had already reached its conclusion in her mind long before that night, and everything he was seeing was the result of decisions she had made without needing his approval. In the weeks that followed, the situation unfolded exactly as she had outlined. Legal proceedings moved forward, financial arrangements shifted, and the narrative David had relied on began to collapse under the weight of documented reality. But the most significant change wasn't in the legal outcome or the financial consequences. It was in the balance of identity. Linda no longer carried the version of herself that had been shaped by his perception. She moved forward with a clarity that came from understanding her own resilience. David, on the other hand, was left to confront a reality he had underestimated, one where control had limits and assumptions carried consequences. And in the end, the story wasn't defined by a single moment of confrontation, but by the accumulation of choices, quiet, deliberate, and precise, that led to an outcome he never saw coming. So the question remains, when control replaces respect and silence replaces understanding, is the outcome ever really surprising? Or is it simply the result of something that was always building beneath the surface, waiting for the moment when it could no longer be ignored? The legal outcome marked the end of their marriage, but it did not immediately settle everything that had been set in motion over the years. What followed was quieter, less visible, but in many ways more revealing than the confrontation itself. David adjusted to a reality he had never prepared for, one where his decisions no longer carried the same authority and where the narrative he had relied on no longer protected him. At first, he maintained a sense of distance, telling himself that time would restore some version of control, that Linda's actions were temporary, driven by emotion rather than permanence. But as weeks turned into months, it became clear that nothing about her choices had been impulsive. Everything she had done was deliberate, structured, and final in a way he hadn't believed possible. And it was in that realization that something shifted in him, not immediately into regret, but into a slow understanding that what he had dismissed as weakness had been something far more resilient. Linda, on the other hand, moved forward with a kind of steadiness that didn't seek attention or validation. She didn't rebuild her life in dramatic ways. She did it quietly, through consistent decisions that reflected the independence she had once lost and then reclaimed. She returned to work on her own terms, not to prove anything to anyone, but because it was part of who she had always been before everything changed. The difference now was that her identity no longer depended on anyone else's recognition. People who knew her noticed the shift, not in what she said, but in how she carried herself. There was a calm confidence that came from having faced something difficult and come through it without needing to explain it. She didn't speak about David often, and when she did, it wasn't with anger, but with a clarity that suggested she had already processed what needed to be understood. Months later, in a moment that neither of them had planned, David reached out. It wasn't dramatic or emotional, it was simple, a message that carried more hesitation than certainty. He asked to meet, to talk, to revisit what had happened in a way that might offer some sense of closure. When Linda agreed, it wasn't out of curiosity or lingering attachment, but because she understood that some conversations, even when they change nothing, still need to happen. When they sat across from each other again, the difference between them was unmistakable. David spoke more carefully than he used to, choosing his words with an awareness that hadn't been there before. He acknowledged things he had once denied, not perfectly, not completely, but enough to show that time had forced him to confront parts of himself he had avoided. He talked about regret, about misunderstanding what mattered, about how easily he had assumed things would always remain the same. But what stood out most wasn't what he said, it was what he didn't ask. He didn't ask her to come back, didn't suggest rebuilding what they had lost, and in that restraint was an understanding that some things, once broken in a certain way, don't return to what they were. Linda listened without interruption, not because she needed to hear it, but because she recognized the effort it took for him to say it at all. When she finally responded, her words were measured, direct, and free of the weight they might have carried before. She didn't revisit the past in detail, didn't argue or correct. She simply acknowledged that what had happened had changed both of them, but not in the same direction. She told him that she had spent a long time trying to understand where things had gone wrong, trying to hold on to something that no longer existed in the way she remembered it. But at some point, she had realized that understanding the past didn't mean she had to return to it. She had rebuilt her life, not as a reaction to what he had done, but as a continuation of who she was before everything shifted. And in that process, she had found something she hadn't expected, a sense of peace that didn't rely on resolution from anyone else. David listened, and for the first time, he didn't interrupt, didn't challenge, didn't try to reshape the conversation into something more comfortable. He accepted what she was saying, not because it was easy, but because he understood it was true. When they parted, there was no dramatic ending, no final argument or emotional collapse, just a quiet acknowledgement that their paths had separated in a way that wouldn't cross again. And in that moment, the story reached its true conclusion, not in the legal decisions or the confrontation that had changed everything, but in the acceptance that followed. Linda walked away with a sense of closure that didn't depend on his understanding, while David remained with the realization that control, once lost in that way, isn't something that can be regained through apology alone. In the end, what defined their story wasn't just the imbalance that had once existed, but the way it had been corrected, not through force or conflict, but through patience, clarity, and the refusal to remain in a place that no longer reflected who she was. And so the question that remains isn't about who won or who lost, but about what it takes for someone to recognize their own strength after it has been dismissed for so long. Because sometimes the most powerful form of revenge isn't about causing harm in return, it's about rebuilding in a way that leaves no space for the past to repeat itself. And when that happens, the person who once held control is left not with defeat, but with something far more difficult to face, the understanding of what they lost and the knowledge that it cannot be undone. Please type in the comment section what you think of Linda's comeback, and don't forget to comment where you are watching from. See you in my next video.